Good evening. I'm Mark Hauser, the Student Programs Manager here at the Cato Institute, and I'm delighted to welcome you to another Libertarianism versus Conservatism debate. Tonight, 2 interns from the Cato Institute and 2 interns from the Heritage Foundation will tackle the question, is libertarianism or conservatism the superior political philosophy? When I opened this debate last year, I spoke about how excited I was to see that a question of political philosophy once again drew a capacity crowd to the Cato Institute. It was an encouraging reminder that some people in the city really do care about fundamental principles and not just the politics of the day. However, as excited as I was then, I don't think I fully appreciated the significance of this sort of event. A year ago, there was a great deal that I unwittingly took for granted about the manner in which we discuss things like politics and political philosophy. But several things have happened in the past year that made me recognize how special events like this are. You've probably heard of the hostility toward free speech and rational discourse that's being advanced on many of this country's college campuses. For example, the idea that speech we dislike is tantamount to violence, and that we must either seek refuge from it in safe spaces or even suppress that disagreeable speech with violence of our own. Or the idea that an argument's validity is contingent on the identity of the speaker rather than reason and evidence. And on an even more fundamental and disturbing level, there are rejections of logic, reason, and empiricism on the grounds that they are nothing more than completely arbitrary social constructs, with no more validity than any other way of making sense of the world around us, such as feelings or superstitions. Now, if only this bizarre indifference to fact and reality were confined to a few confused radical college students. But alas, we are saddled with a president who, both on the campaign trail and from the Oval Office, has repeatedly spoken and tweeted as if the facts of reality were whatever he decided them to be. Certainly, the observation that politicians say things that aren't true isn't new or interesting. It's possible that Trump lies with greater frequency and alacrity than what we've come to expect from politicians, but even if that's the case, it's not what really bothered me. The real difference I saw was the way that people have responded to those fabrications and misrepresentations. In a recent interview, Scott Adams, best known as the creator of the comic strip Dilbert, expressed the sort of response to Trump's falsehoods that I find truly disturbing. Adams acknowledged, without qualification, that Trump says things that are factually wrong. However, he dismissed those inaccuracies by claiming that the things Trump says, however factually incorrect, are emotionally true. Emotionally true statements. Not accurate, but nonetheless acceptable to many people whose feelings those statements validate. That strikes me as a rejection of reality and rationality on par with the most outlandish claims of the radical college campus leftists. So I come to tonight's debate with a new appreciation for the sort of rational debate we're going to have here. I realize now that, regardless of the political philosophy to which you subscribe, your participation in this debate is itself an expression of particular values. It's a rejection of the notion that words and ideas are forms of violence, and a rejection of the idea that we must shield ourselves from ideas that we dislike. All of you expect to hear things with which you disagree, and maybe even some things that you find offensive. But you're here anyway. You understand that exposing your ideas to challenge is essential to their continued revision and refinement. And you're expecting the debaters to argue with reason and with evidence. And I dare say you'd find it disappointing and distasteful if, in a forum like this, they tried to make their arguments through empty emotionalism, hyperbole, and outright fabrications. These values matter. The material and moral condition of mankind has improved immeasurably over the course of its history. However, this progress was not and is not an inevitable fact of our existence. It was and remains contingent upon, among other things, the continual examination of the ideas by which we live our lives and build our societies. And that is why it is no mere pleasantry when I say that I thank you for joining us this evening. I sincerely appreciate the values you express by doing so. Thank you. Now, just a little bit of housekeeping before we begin. After the conclusion of this debate, please join us for a reception which will take place both on this floor in the Winter Garden and also up the spiral staircase on the second floor. Neither of these areas is a designated safe space, so feel free to continue the debate during the reception. But don't wait until the reception to join in. I encourage you to share your thoughts on Twitter and other social media by using the hashtag LVCDebate. We also have our own Snapchat filter for this debate, and if you send snaps to Cato Institute, one word, they may be featured on our social media accounts. I would also appreciate your participation in a post-debate survey. You'll receive that by email, and it's your chance to let us know who you think prevailed in this debate, and also offer your opinion on a number of other issues. The results from that survey will be out sometime next week. I must also issue a reminder that these teams are labeled Conservatism and Libertarianism, not Heritage and Cato. The interns do not represent and will not be speaking on behalf of either the Heritage Foundation or the Cato Institute. Please respect this distinction, especially if you're posting about the debate on social media. Finally, I need to thank Cato's outstanding conference staff for handling the logistics of this event. I would also like to thank Elena Richardson of the Heritage Foundation and Eleanor Renner, whose cooperation was essential to pulling this debate together. Katie Ranville, Cato's Student Programs Coordinator, was not only a big help in organizing this debate, but also in making sure our department continued running when debate-related work started consuming all of my time. There's a reason you don't see very many events like this happening in DC, despite the fact that they're obviously tremendously popular. There's a lot of work that goes into pulling them off, and I don't take for granted all the help we get in doing that. Also, on behalf of the Libertarian debaters, I'd like to acknowledge Dylan Moore, their fellow intern who assisted them with their preparation and also prepared to step in as an alternate had that been necessary. Fortunately, it wasn't. He will be assisting with timekeeping tonight. The last person I need to thank is Charles C.W. Cook, who graciously agreed to moderate tonight's debate. He is the editor of National Review Online, a co-host of the Mad Dogs and Englishmen podcast, and most relevant to tonight's debate, he's the author of the Conservatarian Manifesto. He's a graduate of the University of Oxford, at which he studied modern history and politics. He's a frequent guest on HBO's Real Time with Bill Maher and has broadcast for the BBC, MSNBC, and Fox Business. He emigrated to the United States in 2011 and lives in Connecticut with his wife, their son, and, reflecting his excellent taste in canines, a black Labrador. Please welcome Charles C.W. Cook.
Thank you all for coming and for having me here. It's a great pleasure to be back at Cato and to have been asked to moderate this debate, which is on a topic I have an enormous amount of interest in. A couple of years ago, as was said earlier, I wrote a book called The Conservatarian Manifesto, in which I tried to outline where I thought the American right was headed, and perhaps more important, where I thought it should be headed. Among other things, the book was a response to a phrase that I kept hearing on college campuses. Students would say, when I'm around libertarians, I feel conservative. And when I'm around conservatives, I feel libertarian. And I started to see a word popping up. That word was conservatarian, or from the less literary within the group, liberservative, which happily died a quick and fiery death. In some ways, I considered my book a mercy killing for that word. And I was interested in that because, depending on the issue, that was broadly how I felt as well. I've had lunches here in this building at Cato, at which I've been happily chatting away to the person next to me, and it's been going great. We've been agreeing on this or that. And just as I've got into my comfort zone, everything changes. My jaw hits the floor, and I say, "You think that? Wow, I'd better go and audit the sandwiches and stand in the corner." And I'm sure I've had precisely the same effect on others. But tonight, there will be no chance for sandwich auditing. Tonight, we're going to hash out the questions before us, respectfully, but forcefully, I hope, and in depth. And they are meaningful questions. Because of the way in which conservatism and libertarianism are conflated in our political discourse, I think many Americans believe that these internecine arguments are relatively arcane, that they are, to borrow from Monty Python, disagreements between the Judean People's Front and the People's Front of Judea. But nothing could be further from the truth. Many of the divisions you will hear tonight are foundational, as foundational perhaps as the divisions between the left and the right, as indeed are many of the things on which we superficially agree. And I think we've seen a lot of that just this week with the Cotton-Purdue immigration bill, which has flared tempers on the right just as much as elsewhere. We saw it last week with President Trump's tweeted announcement that transgendered Americans will be excluded from military service. And we're presumably about to see it when tax reform gets started in earnest. Conservatives and libertarians often disagree, and tonight we're here to work out how so. Before we get started, I'd like to convey a couple of ground rules. The first is, however good a point is, please don't applaud or boo. We can do that at the end. And the second, if you do have a cell phone, please smash it into 10,000 pieces before we start so that it doesn't go off, or at least put it into airplane mode, whichever one is cheaper. And finally, to everyone involved, good luck. Cato audiences are notoriously knowledgeable and engaged. Last time I was here, I got a question about the Commerce Clause to the Constitution and the case of Gonzalez v. Raich. And in the course of answering it, my eyes panned around the room and alighted on Randy Barnett, who argued the case before the Supreme Court, which was a little bit like being asked a question on the Constitution, looking around and seeing James Madison sitting in the front row. It's just the sort of place that Cato is. The resolution tonight is libertarianism or conservatism the superior political philosophy? This debate will be segmented into a few sections. We'll hear brief opening statements and rebuttals. Then we'll have a discussion about 4 discrete topics, which I'll choose and introduce. The third section will give our debaters a chance to make the case why a libertarian should be a conservative and vice versa. And then we'll go on to some floor speeches, thinly disguised as questions. And then we will wrap up with conclusions from both sides, and then segregate ourselves into those 2 rooms and start drinking. Our debaters tonight, on the libertarian side, we have John Konecki, a rising junior at Vanderbilt University, where he studies political science and Russian studies. Jack Brown, a rising second-year law student at the Antonin Scalia Law School at George Mason University. On the conservative side, we have Meridian Paulton, who is a rising senior at Patrick Henry College, where she studies American politics and policy, and Elle Rogers, who is a rising junior at the King's College in New York City, where she studies philosophy. And with that, I shall hand it over to the conservative side to make their opening statement from the podium.
I know that this is a debate, so I'm supposed to start with all the things that we disagree about and get immediately into that. But I actually want to begin tonight with where we agree. Because people do get conservatives and libertarians mixed up a lot. A lot of times we do work together on things because there are points where we agree. So I think there are 2 points where conservatives and libertarians agree. First, we are anti-collectivist. And secondly, and I think this is where we can see the distinctions play out, is we are lovers of individual freedom. We really are. So the question tonight is not a question of whether we should have freedom. The question is rather, whither freedom? And what I mean by that is, where does freedom come from? What are the rightful ends of freedom? And what are the bounds of freedom in a civil context? So in order to help you understand that, I'm going to define conservatism and libertarianism. We define libertarianism as a political philosophy which holds that personal liberty is an end in itself. Conservatism is a political philosophy which views personal liberty as a means to human flourishing. So the distinction then is in this definition of liberty and what we actually mean by personal liberty. So as we look at this concept of human flourishing, I think it's helpful for us to think about this in context of civil society, individuals, and the government, and how those 3 things all relate. So let's look first at the individual. I think we all believe here that there is something special about the individual, but conservatives in particular believe that the individual has this certain dignity inherent to him, and that confers upon him certain rights, and that other individuals have certain duties toward the individuals around them. So a great example of how this plays out is in terms of the family. I, Meridian Paulton, do not exist just by myself. I didn't spontaneously combust into existence. I came because I have a mother and a father. And that's how all of civil society forms. Even if we were to get rid of government, all civil institutions, we would have to have a family at the core of a society to even be able to have people in the first place. So we as conservatives believe that the family is the basis of civil society for that simple logical reason, that you have to have it. Then from the family, we can move out and see the other institutions that build up our civil society. So for example, we have religious institutions that help us to look beyond ourselves. We have institutions like the media that help us to understand what is going on around us. And importantly, we have interest groups and associations of common interests, even places like Cato and Heritage, which are seeking to make the world a better place, seeking to better their community, seeking to pursue a common interest or hobby. We believe that those are all things which people should be able to do. Individual liberty should be an ends to doing those things so that people can be the best people that they are. Because the reality is that we're capable of great decisions, but we're also capable of making poor decisions. And we want to ensure that people are able to have the choice to make those good decisions, that they're not in a place where civil society devolves to each individual's choice. So the way that we see this play out then in government is that the government's role is to encourage individual liberty, but encourage individual liberty toward the end of ensuring that individuals can engage in this civil society, that the family is upheld, and that the government is protecting the borders of its nation, protecting the safety of its people, so that they can enjoy the civil society in which they live. So the question today is not whether we should have freedom, but it's whither freedom. We believe that freedom exists for human flourishing, and that's why we find that the conservative political philosophy is the superior one tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. And if I could now invite the Libertarian side to make its opening statement.
Thank you very much. Libertarians and conservatives are often viewed as intellectual bedfellows. Conservatives are often aligned with libertarians on such issues as cutting government spending on entitlement programs, private property rights, and free markets. However, conservatism is plagued with inconsistencies that ultimately make it incompatible with individual liberty and limited government. Libertarianism's consistent, principled approach offers a superior alternative. Conservatives often rail against wasteful government spending, but they insatiably pursue ever more military spending in the same way that those on the left seek more spending on unsustainable entitlement programs. Furthermore, although our government spends more on the military than the next 8 countries combined, we have not benefited from our wars overseas. We have nothing to show for our 16-year occupation of Afghanistan, and our 8-year occupation of Iraq created a power vacuum filled by ISIS. Our military adventurism has done little but make an already volatile region even worse. The never-ending war on terror has also had severe consequences for our civil liberties, with the NSA collecting the phone records of tens of millions of Americans, and the TSA subjecting us to invasive pat-downs whenever we want to fly for a vacation. Libertarians would prefer a more realistic foreign policy, emphasizing free trade, cooperation, and peace with other nations. Conservatives are also happy to sacrifice limited and constitutional government on the altar of their social preferences. On many social issues, including gay marriage and adoption rights and medicinal and recreational drug use, conservatives are eager to promote their own values through intrusive government power at the expense of individual liberty, the Constitution, and the small government ideals they claim to love. Additionally, their promotion of an expansive government in these areas has not promoted prosperity. Just as alcohol prohibition led to the rise of Al Capone, organized crime, and the prevalence of dangerous drinks, drug prohibition has created gangs of murderous thugs who have ravaged our communities across the country, peddling impure drugs that are unsafe for consumption. Conservatives' commitment to liberty thus extends only to their conception of the good, and their policies have done great harm to the causes of limited government and human prosperity. Libertarians, meanwhile, recognize that individuals tend to know better how to live their lives than any government official. Conservative inconsistency is also apparent when it comes to immigration. For all their claims that America is a land of opportunity, conservatives enthusiastically throw barriers in the way of people who want to escape from places like Syria, Mexico, and Venezuela to better their lives here in America. They claim to care about markets, except when it comes to freedom of contract and the free movement of labor, thus robbing business owners of the freedom to hire whomever they choose. Furthermore, their attempts to bar immigrants from coming to this country rob us of economic growth, despite the lack of competition immigrants provide to American workers and the difficulty they have in accessing welfare programs. Instead of welcoming people who recognize the prosperity that American freedom can provide, conservatives would rather exclude and demonize them at the expense of the economic benefits they offer. Libertarians would allow these people into the country, recognizing that immigration is the sincerest form of flattery. Even more frustrating than their inconsistency, however, is conservatives' short-sightedness. They fail to see that a government powerful and intrusive enough to suppress gay marriage today is powerful enough to force Christian bakers to bake cakes for gay weddings tomorrow. They can't comprehend that a government that can force local law enforcement to enforce federal immigration laws now could just as easily compel it to enforce federal gun control laws in the future. Their approach to government leaves all that they hold dear at risk should they lose so much as one election. We should therefore look to libertarians rather than conservatives to defend individual liberty and to limit government, and thus to secure the essential conditions for human prosperity. Libertarians have a long history of providing a principled defense of limited government in all policy areas, and we have the foresight to recognize that a state powerful enough to enforce your social preferences is powerful enough to destroy the liberties you cherish. Libertarianism is therefore ultimately superior to conservatism because its adherents recognize that a genuine commitment to limiting government power is the essential way to secure our freedom, security, and prosperity, far more so than any wall, any army, or any president could ever be. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we have 2 minutes for the conservative rebuttal.
Well, when we're discussing libertarianism and conservatism, I think we really have to have a robust understanding of what the practice of politics is. The practice of politics is about seeking the good of the city. Individual liberty itself is not our goal. Again, it's a means to an end, and it's a means that we ought to cherish, as thankfully our founding fathers and those who have come before us do. We ought to cherish it as well, so that future generations will know what it means to live free lives. But limitless freedom devolves into anarchy. And if individual liberty is our goal, then that's fine. I guess that's a way that we can live our lives. But justice in the city requires that we look outside of ourselves. Justice in the city requires that we consider those who came before us, listening to their wisdom and gleaning it such that we can create a better future for posterity. There's a really beautiful passage in Edmund Burke, where he discusses these little platoons: the family, the church, the charity. And it's through these groups like Cato and like Heritage too, where we discover what it actually means to be free. It's through the particular loves that we discover those loves that are universal. And so when we discuss conservatism and libertarianism, before we get into policy discussions, many of which were brought up by the opposition, we have to first consider, ought we consider man merely as an individual or as one unit of a larger group? To slightly paraphrase Bono, we're not the same, but we are one. We're members of larger communities. It's common sense. We can't get away from the fact that we were born to certain parents in certain times, and that we are at all times surrounded by others. We are never more in our nature than when we're with other people. We have to take that very seriously, because there's a society that existed before we came here on the scene, and it's one that will exist long after we're gone. We can care about ourselves, or we can pay the due deference we owe to that posterity. It's our posterity. It's the posterity of those around us. It's the debt we owe to the living and to those who will come after us as well.
Thank you. And now a rebuttal from the libertarian side.
Thank you very much. So with regard to the claim that unleashed liberty will lead to anarchy, the fact of the matter is that neither I nor my partner are anarchists. We simply believe that the state exists to protect us from others, not ourselves. Our philosophy is grounded in humility. We recognize that we do not have the knowledge and wisdom necessary to tell people how to live, and neither does anyone else. I think J.R.R. Tolkien, the famous fantasy novelist, said it best when he said that the most improper job of any man, even saints, who at any rate were at least unwilling to take it on, is bossing other men. Second, we take issue with the portrayal of our view of liberty as an end in itself. We, in fact, disagree completely. David Bose, the executive vice president of the Cato Institute, defines civil society as all the voluntary interactions among people, everything that is not the coercive state, including clubs, communities, families, churches, and every other occasion for voluntary, non-governmental interaction in a society. Contrary to the way that the conservatives portrayed us, we are not atomistic individualists. We don't believe ourselves to be isolated from the rest of the world. We recognize and, in fact, embrace the fact that cooperation is essential for human flourishing. This indeed makes libertarians the best defenders of civil society. We don't want to tear apart families by sentencing parents to years in prison for nonviolent drug offenses. We don't want to send our children and our children's children to fight pointless wars in the Middle East. And we want to make it as easy as possible for people to come to this country and make an honest living. Thank you.
Thank you. We now move on to the topical debates. Be 4 topics introduced one after the other, with time for both opening statements and then rebuttals. The first topic will be on the question, American military dominance makes us safer, freer, and more prosperous. Is that true or false? We will start with the libertarian side.
Yes. Thank you. America during its founding was in dire straits. It was a fledgling country surrounded by hostile nations, with Britain to the north, Spain to the south, and many Indian tribes to the west. Despite this, the founders were highly skeptical of a standing military, with Samuel Adams contending that the military should be watched with a jealous eye, and James Madison arguing that a standing military force with an overgrown executive will not long be safe companions to liberty. Conservatives disagree. They claim that American military dominance is essential for preserving our safety, freedom, and prosperity. Libertarians believe this view to be incredibly naive and argue that spending nearly $900 billion on our national security is not necessary to protect us from foreign threats and has actually been counterproductive in this regard. In their attempt to make the world more secure, conservatives have fallen into a trap that F.A. Hayek called the fatal conceit. Conservatives rightly believe that the government does a poor job of managing things here at home, but don't apply that scrutiny to the military's nation-building efforts. Our military lacks the knowledge necessary to build countries from scratch. The success stories of Germany and Japan after World War II involved rebuilding existing institutions rather than creating them from whole cloth, unlike our modern interventions. More than a decade after the beginning of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, neither country is a free democracy, despite trillions of dollars spent attempting to make them so. Both have authoritarian governments that restrict free speech and religious liberty and are plagued by corruption. This is leaving aside the rise of ISIS from the power vacuum we created and Iran's increasing influence over the Iraqi government, not to mention our less recent but equally disastrous interventions, including Vietnam and Somalia. Our interventions have been failures, not through ineptitude on the part of our troops, but because creating successful nations through top-down planning is impossible. Although conservatives argue that our massive military is necessary to fight foreign threats, this is not the case. We do not need to spend as much as we do on our military to fight the threats commonly cited by conservatives as making the spending necessary. According to the Institute for the Study of War, a think tank often aligned with conservatives on this issue, ISIS's territory has been shrinking for the past few months, with our Middle Eastern allies doing most of the heavy lifting, as they should given their investment in the region. We have an overwhelming advantage over North Korea's military. Iran is a Shiite majority nation surrounded by hostile Sunni countries. Russia lacks the resources to equal us militarily, possessing only one tiny aircraft carrier compared to our 11 supercarriers. Finally, China is penned in by South Korea, Japan, and India, all 3 of whom possess strong militaries in their own right. Not only have our interventions been unsuccessful, they are also unnecessary. We simply can't spend our way out of our security concerns. One more military base won't add much extra security to the 800 we have overseas. Conservative foreign policy is therefore naive and wasteful. They believe that the military can successfully coerce and nation build, despite all evidence to the contrary, and they overestimate the threat that other nations pose. A non-interventionist libertarian approach represents the realistic alternative. Thank you.
Thank you. And now the conservative opening statement on this question.
In his farewell address, George Washington gives what I think is a really good framework for American foreign policy. He lays out a vision for a nation, America, that would one day be able to choose peace or war as our best interests, guided by justice, shall counsel. American military dominance has made us freer, safer, and more prosperous. And it allows us the choice of peace or war, so that our enemies don't have to decide that for us or for any other nation in the world. Now, we need to clarify our terms. Military dominance means having and exerting certain military capacities such that we can contend with other world powers, and to a superior degree. We're not debating whether or not we ought to spend less money on the military. The opposition team to talk a lot about how much money we're spending on our military. And yet their argument proves that we do have military dominance. They seem to be answering the question, is the US military dominant? Or are we overestimating our threats? But the fact is, military dominance, which both sides seem to agree that we have, is necessary in a world where other powers are uninterested in choosing based on the Council of Justice. See, the libertarian view of foreign policy, that we ought to just stay between the two oceans surrounding us, only works if every other country in the world is interested in nothing but market share. That's simply not the case. Who matches us in military capacity, or rather, who can match us? Let's imagine day one, if tonight President Trump decided we were going to cede military dominance and go to these supposedly small levels of Chinese and Russian capacities. Tomorrow we were at number 2 or lower. Who takes our place? China or Russia? It's not the United Kingdom. So then, who is it that's choosing? It's nations who are more interested in murdering state enemies, dictating how many children we're allowed to have, and neglecting the right of other peoples to govern themselves, who are calling the shots. Even more than that, terrorism still poses an existential threat. Maybe ISIS has lost ground, and yet they're still committing and planning terrorist attacks on Western soil. That's a threat that we ought to take very seriously, because it's something that threatens the very way of life we as Americans enjoy. What happened when we ceded military dominance in the past? Kosovo, the Gulf War, Pearl Harbor, 9/11. There's a precedent. It's a pretty dangerous one. Now, on the opposite hand, what happened when we exerted our military strength? Well, the Soviet Union collapsed. We introduced democracy to nations around the world. The Monroe Doctrine brought prosperity not just to the United States, but to other nations as well. See, the American way of life is fundamentally different than other ways of life. The government doesn't murder its enemies. We don't determine how many children people ought to have. We adjudicate our disputes in courts rather than violently. Those are things that we ought to celebrate, things we ought to cherish, and things that we always ought to be protecting ourselves from when it comes to other countries.
Thank you. The Libertarian rebuttal.
Well, with regard to the issue of dominance, the fact of the matter is that England and France aren't dominant, but they can still take care of themselves. We don't need to be dominant in order to protect ourselves from threats. With regard to Russia and China, the fact of the matter is China is penned in by South Korea, Japan, and India. India has a very sizable population. South Korea is one of the most technologically advanced countries in the world. And Japan's military was described by John T. Kuhn, a professor of military history at the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College, that pilot for pilot, ship for ship, Japan can stand toe-to-toe with anybody. To the extent that Russia threatens our allies, the fact of the matter is that in Europe, our allies aren't paying their fair share. European defense should be paid for by Europeans. And by paying for their defense, we're effectively subsidizing their welfare states and leaving them vulnerable to attack. We've basically made Europe dependent on us, and what is more, again, we're supporting essentially socialized medicine. Finally, with regard to ISIS, ISIS does indeed take credit for a lot of terrorist attacks that have gone on throughout the world. Thank you.
Well, here's what we're asking. Somebody is going to make a choice, whether there's peace or whether there's war. Do we want it to be us, or would we rather it be Vladimir Putin calling the shots? Maybe you think that American military involvement has been a failure. Maybe you think that we spend far too much. Maybe you think that ISIS doesn't pose the threat we think it does. But right now, North Korea is building the capacity to send over a nuclear missile that could hit the United States in 33 minutes. At the end of the day, I'd rather that we continue spending the money that we do on our military, that we continue building our capacity such that we can protect against threats such as those. At the end of the day, it's American military dominance that has made the world a better place. England and France, along with the rest of Europe and the rest of that continent, are currently contending with existential terrorist threats and terrorist attacks happening on their own soil. That's not what I would call capacity for military dominance. Either we're going to choose war or peace for ourselves, as justice might counsel, or we're going to let somebody else do it. Based off of the people who are able to do it, I'd rather it be a nation committed to justice and committed to the capacity for self-governance.
Thank you. We'll now move on to the second proposition, which is recreational drugs should be legalized as alcohol is. And on this one, the Conservatives will open with their statement.
I'm sure that my libertarian friends opposite will begin their statements by telling you how we should have the freedom to do whatever we want, how recreational drugs are just for fun and people should be able to choose that and make decisions about their own bodies. But I'm here to tell you that this affects a lot more than just the individual who takes those drugs, and that it's very harmful to that individual as well. We're all very aware of the opioid crisis that has recently been making the news, the hillbilly elegy, the reality that millions of Americans are taking very strong drugs, and we witness thousands upon thousands of overdoses from drugs like heroin every single year in America, and that's on the rise. So why should we not just legalize that, though? Why should we not just accept that that should be the norm, or that we should somehow minimize that usage by legalizing it? The difference in between this argument, for example, for alcohol, that I'm sure my libertarian opponents will mention, is that this is a very different type of drug that we're talking about. When we say that we're going to legalize any kind of recreational drug, we're not talking about something that you take casually. I can go and drink a glass of wine to get drunk if I want to. I can also just drink it socially. You cannot do that with hard drugs. For example, if you take heroin, that goes immediately into your bloodstream. And one dose of heroin will immediately impact your mental capacities, and that's irreversible. It's also incredibly addictive to the point where if you begin to take these, you'll have to take increasing dosages, and that's why we see this overdosing that happens in America. But this affects more than just these individuals who are taking it and the people who are dying from this. This affects their communities and their children as well. Because this means people can't be parents that they need to be. This means that they can't be the members of civil society that they need to be. It's a very dangerous thing to allow individuals not only to harm themselves, to harm their own quality of life, but also to go out and harm other individuals. So if my libertarian friends want to argue that this is that the principle of allowing individuals to take these drugs will not affect other individuals, that's simply not true. I'm sure we can all think of someone that we know who has taken hard drugs. As a result of that, is unable to be the kind of parent they need to be, has maybe even overdosed because of that. That degrades our civil society. There's also a clear link between increasing drug usage and increase in crime. And that's ignoring crime related to going in the black market that my libertarian friends may want to raise. That's other crimes too. That's crimes like murder and theft. Those are their crimes, their destruction of personal property, all related to drugs. That's impacting a lot more than just one person. That's impacting private property, something I'm sure even the libertarians in this room can concede is something that should not be imposed upon.
Our conservative opponents are correct when they say that the libertarian case for drug legalization does begin with the fundamental idea that the government has no business dictating what people can and cannot put into their bodies. And yes, for some in this room, that's really all the reason that they need to justify legalizing drugs such as marijuana, cocaine, and yes, even drugs such as heroin. However, pure principle is not the only reason to legalize narcotics. If you instead look at the consequences of the war on drugs, you will see that the costs of prohibition absolutely outweigh the benefits, and that we should therefore legalize drugs in the same way that we legalize alcohol. Now, those who disagree no doubt do so because they view drugs as dangerous. So I'll start there, and largely on a point of agreement, because yes, drugs can be dangerous, but forcing them to be sold on the black market only compounds that danger. When a substance is illicit, manufacturers make it more powerful, because serving the needs of more people per ounce is important when that product is being secretly produced and sold. For example, before and after alcohol prohibition, beer and wine were the most common drinks in America, but during prohibition, they were replaced by a lot of hard alcohol, such as vodka and Everclear. Also, if we have a legal market for drugs, then we have quality assurance. This way, producers cannot get away with selling tainted products. So legalization would make drugs and drug markets less dangerous, as violent street operations would be replaced by legal businesses. But the war on drugs has done more than just make drugs dangerous. Its punitive nature has ripped holes in our communities and dehumanized victims of drug abuse. Since 1979, our prison population has skyrocketed by 400%, in no small part because of both the harsh sentencing of nonviolent drug offenders and the surge the surge of drug-related gang violence. Moreover, for one stupid choice, people have been tossed in prison for decades, and even when they get out, the felony on their record inhibits their ability to get a job or a loan and fix their lives. Conservatives have talked about the effects on communities from drugs, but they also fail to realize that the war on drugs is an important cause of this, as countless fathers have fallen victim to the punitive drug policies of the past 30 years, leading to a rise in single motherhood. Finally, the war on drugs has blown a hole in our civil liberties and antagonized relations between law enforcement and their communities. We've seen a startling militarization of the police, an insidious rise in civil asset forfeiture, and the number of SWAT raids per day has increased from 3 in 1980 to over 100 today. And all of this was for what exactly? Our conservative opponents might lead you to believe that this war on drugs is substantially reducing drug use, but that's nonsense. With all due respect, we can't keep drugs out of our prisons, let alone our communities. The failed war on drugs has proven that, yes, there is always going to be drug use in society, and there will be consequences to that use. But let's not add to that the consequences of drug prohibition.
Well, I think we need to clarify that the war on drugs, reforming the way that we do the war on drugs is not equivalent to legalizing all drugs. When we talk about legalizing recreational drugs, which is what we're talking about, we're not just talking about marijuana. I think that the effects of legalizing marijuana have been incredibly perverse and have actually increased the number of users of those drugs. I'm from Colorado. I've seen that. There's actually an increase in that. There's also been an increase in crime related to those drugs in Colorado where that's been done. But we're not just talking about that. We're talking about these very hard drugs that do kill people. That's very different from alcohol. As you mentioned, in the 1920s, alcohol was very common. It still is very common. It is addictive, certainly. You can get drunk, but it does not go to your brain in the same way that a drug does, and it does not affect you long term unless you develop a very severe alcoholic disorder, and even then you can recover from that, something you simply can't do from hard drugs.
Well, first of all, it's patently false that you cannot recover from a drug disorder. But let's move on from that and talk about Colorado. Increased drug use in Colorado is not a product of legalization. Drug use had been increasing for the past 15 years. If anything, the legalization of drugs is a product of people's decreased fear of drugs and increased use of them. All right? And crime rates in Seattle, Denver, and Portland, cities in 3 states that have thus far legalized drugs, there's some others, but the ones that have actually opened up shops, crime rates have neither risen nor declined in those areas. Seattle crime briefly spiked in 2013, but then once marijuana stores actually opened towards the end of 2014, it went back down. I also want to talk about this notion that drugs are addictive, because new research is showing that, in fact, our perception of addiction is not quite accurate, and here's why. If you look, for example, at Vietnam soldiers if you look at soldiers in Vietnam, many of them used heroin because they were in a horrible environment and it was all they had. And people assumed that when they came back, they would remain addicted to heroin. But in fact, when they came back, the vast majority of them had no problem because they had been removed from the horrible environment that they were in. All right, drug addiction comes, time's up, okay.
Well, thank you. The third topic. The best way for the US to address illegal immigration is stricter enforcement of existing immigration laws. And the Libertarian side will kick this one off.
Many conservatives like to say that they are fine with immigration so long as it is not illegal. To that I say, fantastic. Let's make this immigration legal. The solution to the immigration issues that face our nation today is not a stricter enforcement of our current policy, but rather a liberalization of our immigration law. Presently, we've made it incredibly difficult to legally immigrate to this country. You can only do so through marriage, company sponsorship, refugee status, or a diversity lottery. This makes it nearly impossible for the low-skilled worker at our border to arrive legally, resulting in the illegal immigration we deal with today. Removing these restrictions would allow these same illegals to choose to immigrate legally. Now, conservatives may balk at the volume of immigrants that may arrive. They fear negative economic effects, and they have security concerns. Therefore, I would like to demonstrate to them that the immigrants benefit our economy much more than they may detract from it, and then I would like to alleviate their concerns about crime and terrorism. Let's start with the economy. Unrestricted global immigration would grow the world economy by anywhere between $35 and $105 trillion. This is because many will immigrate to free market countries and become more productive, which benefits everyone. Now, conservatives fear that an influx of unskilled labor will lead to lower wages for American workers. But even the most pessimistic study by George Borjas admits that immigration would cause wages to rise for over 90% of the native population. Only those without a high school degree would see a slight temporary decline. This is because while immigrants do increase the supply of workers, they also increase national consumption and therefore increase the demand for workers. Now, conservatives also intend that immigration is detrimental in a welfare state. But given the positive effects of immigration on the economy, this is more of an argument against the welfare state than it is against immigration. But more importantly, since the welfare reform of 1996, illegal immigrants have been blocked from using programs such as food stamps, and so are legal immigrants for the first 5 years. Now let's talk about security. With increases in immigration, conservatives fear an increase in crime. But indeed, analyses of our prison populations have shown that immigrants, legal and illegal, are less likely to commit crimes than our native populations. And this is further borne out by studies which examine the crime rates of cities that receive more immigration. With few exceptions, the crime rates of these cities decline. Terrorism is the other security concern, but libertarians have no desire to get rid of our current screening process, a process which thus far has been much more successful than you may have been led to believe. Since its modern implementation in the 1980s, our screening process for refugees has led to there not being a single death from a refugee terrorist. And with the exception of one of the 1993 World Trade Center bombing conspirators, there have been no terrorist deaths ever from illegal immigration. So yes, immigration gives positive effects, and the limited temporary negatives, while present, must be understood in this context. The benefits outweigh the costs, and therefore, in order to solve America's immigration problems, we should liberalize our immigration laws. Thank you.
Maybe you agree that we should liberalize our immigration laws, but we can't enforce the current immigration policy that we have. Before we think about liberalizing immigration policy, expanding the amount of people we bring here, or limiting it as well, we have to consider very seriously the problem with illegal immigration we have on our hands. We have to figure out first how the heck we're going to enforce the current immigration laws that we have so we can enforce them better in the future. And see, enforcing existing immigration laws preserves the structures that allow us to live in diverse political community together. See, there's an illegal immigration problem. We can either address it or we can ignore it. Now, I'm not talking about the amount of people that we allow to come here. I'm talking about the 11.3 million illegal immigrants currently living in the United States. About 60% of these illegal immigrants are concentrated in about 20 cities. Most of these cities are sanctuary cities, cities that refuse to comply with federal immigration law enforcement. So right now we have an inconsistency between what the law is and what's actually being enforced. There can't be justice in the city when laws are inconsistent or contradicted, especially by members of the city itself. This invites chaos, which is exactly what happened in 2015 when Catherine Steinle was killed by an illegal immigrant in San Francisco, a sanctuary city. Before we consider what needs to be done about immigration itself, we have to consider what we ought to do about our current immigration laws and exactly what went wrong. See, a lack of enforcement is also unfair to the 4.4 million legal immigrants currently waiting to get into the United States. It begs the question, why are we making these legal immigrants or would-be immigrants wait if it's so easy to come into the country illegally? Either there's a purpose to their waiting, or we're just making them wait for no reason at all. A reason that is actually xenophobic in and of itself. So we have unfairness to those who are trying to come to our country legally, trying to access the United States through the processes that have been set up and are unable to do so because of a lack of enforcement. It's also unfair to the American taxpayer. Now, according to a Heritage study, current illegal immigration cost the American taxpayer billions of dollars. In 2010, the average unlawful immigrant household received around $24,000 in government benefits and services, while paying some $10,000 in taxes. This generated an average annual fiscal deficit of around $14,000 per household. Now, remember, when we talk about politics, we're discussing the practice of seeking goods for the city. A nation is is a nation is a nation. And if it doesn't have borders, it's not a nation. A nation has to look out for those who live within its borders legally. Putting this burden of illegal immigration on American taxpayers and on immigrants who have come here legally and have added vast amounts of value to our economy is not the way to address the problems that we have. It's just detrimental to ourselves and posterity.
All right. So I think we have a bit to agree on. I agree that those waiting in line shouldn't be waiting. That's why I want to liberalize our immigration laws. But there's something else you said that I very much agree with, and it's that we can't enforce the current immigration policy we have in place. I agree. So why are we trying to more strictly enforce it to solve our problems if that can't be done? If you want to cut illegal immigration, do what they did in the 1950s, where they had a temporary guest worker program, and people were able to come in, and illegal immigration decreased by 90%. That's a far more effective way of decreasing illegal immigration and getting people in the country on our books than any enforcement measure you could propose. You talk about national sovereignty, and yes, our countries do have borders. Our borders exist so that armies don't cross them, not simply people, all right? Moreover, maybe I shouldn't have said all right, but also you talk about a study that talks about immigrant households and how they are a net drain. Then the problem with that study is that it counts the native children in those households who use public schooling, but then it does not then account for the taxes that they will go on to pay later in life. So that is simply, and well, time's up, cool.
Well, thank you for pointing out where we agree. And something with which we do agree with our libertarian friends is that there are native-born immigrants who do grow up to be citizens and pay taxes. That's good. But that does nothing to solve the illegal immigrants who live here now. See, yes, we have a debt to posterity, but we also have a debt to the living. We have a debt to ourselves, to our parents, to the families who raised us. Quite frankly, we have to do something about the illegal immigrants living here. We can either ignore the problem and act as if it doesn't exist, or we can enforce the current laws that we have. Now, there's actually a great example about E-Verify, which is an employment eligibility verification program that employers are able to use to ensure that the workers they're hiring are actually legal citizens. And there's evidence showing that employers would actually use it, and they would use it to greater degrees if it were better enforced. There are mechanisms we can use to ensure that those in our country are here legally, that we can incentivize proper immigration, proper adding value to society through legal enforcement measures. That's the course we ought to take.
Thank you. Our fourth and final topic. Americans have sacrificed too much privacy for the sake of security. And on this one, it is the Conservatives' turn to start.
So the argument here, obviously, is that the government can see everything I'm doing. The government reads my emails. The government reads my texts. The government can see me unclothed when I go through the TSA security line. That's largely false. And so I think it's just important to dispel some myths, especially when we talk about about data collection. So the first question we have to ask is, what is the Patriot Act? Because that's what instituted most of these policies. The Patriot Act, as you know, was implemented after 9/11, and the Patriot Act exists to ensure that we don't have terrorists coming and destroying our property. So something even my libertarian friends could agree with, that we don't want these big armies or people affiliated with them coming and destroying our lives and our property. That's the point of it. What the Patriot Act actually does in practice then is it's a collection of metadata, and it's not even just collection of metadata by the government. That's not what happens. Metadata is similar to a read receipt. So you could see that I emailed Billy at 5:32 p.m. But if you were able to see my metadata, you still actually have to get permission to get metadata, but you can see at 5:32 p.m. I emailed Billy. You cannot open that email as an NSA worker until you actually have some kind of permission to go and get a subpoena to get that information. The threshold for getting that subpoena is that you have to actually be able to show that you have a reasonable fear that there's some kind of threat here of a terrorist attack. And this has actually been largely effective. There have been multiple terror attacks, some very large scale, that have actually been prevented in America as a result of this policy. It's not the government going and reading my emails. Same thing applies to some of these other provisions. The government can't just go and look at all this data. Do they ultimately have access to it with a warrant? Yeah, they do, just like they would have access to my other private property if they had a warrant because they had a reasonable fear that I had a bomb in my home or something like that. It's the same idea, it's just in the digital age. That's how this works. What in practice this means is it means that you and I are protected. Our private property is protected. Our right to life is protected. We can live in prosperity here. We can live with the individual freedoms that we have because we know that we don't have to fear living in a place like France. In France right now, if you go in the train station, you'll see signs everywhere telling you something similar to what we'd see in America. If you see something, say something. But then it goes into these great descriptions about all the terror attacks that they've recently suffered. And I'm thankful to say that we don't have that largely in America. We don't have to have these gruesome descriptions because we are protected by things like the USA Patriot Act. And that's why we support the security policies that the United States has enacted.
Conservatives often advocate for policies that compromise our privacy. They argue that we should trust the wise officials in the intelligence community to keep us safe, so long as we allow them access to the most intimate details of our personal lives. However, not only would conservatives view this position as absurd if we were talking about any other government program, but the government officials they want us to trust have done little to inspire confidence. Conservatives appear to have a blind spot when it comes to the security state. Progressives often call for broad government control over healthcare, saying that people will die if it is left in the hands of individuals. Conservatives rightly find such arguments laughable, but not when it comes to surveillance. They blindly trust our intelligence agencies not to abuse the power we've given them. This trust has not been earned. From J. Edgar Hoover threatening Martin Luther King to James Clapper lying to Congress and the country about the NSA's surveillance of our records, our intelligence community has demonstrated a long history of corruption and abuse of power. It does not deserve the deference given to it by conservatives. What makes conservatives' submissiveness on this issue even more disturbing is that for all the liberties they wish to surrender to the security state, our intelligence agencies have done little to keep us safe. Despite the massive amount of phone records and internet metadata collected under the Patriot Act by the NSA, the FBI has been unable to point to a single instance in which that information was necessary for foiling a terrorist plot. In fact, the bulk collection of our records and metadata actually makes catching terrorists more difficult by creating a pool of data that is too large to be sorted through. This criticism applies to more than just telecom surveillance. The TSA is little more than security theater, missing 95% of the Department of Homeland Security's attempts to sneak weapons past its screeners. On top of being an abuse of individual rights, the security state has a poor track record on catching terrorists. Meanwhile, programs like the NYPD's post-9/11 Muslim surveillance program, which failed to generate any leads, I might add, alienate communities who are ideally placed to inform the government about potential terrorist threats. If people find that their privacy is unfairly violated by law enforcement, they won't trust them, leaving citizens far less likely to report suspicious activity. Most importantly of all, however, surrendering our privacy for security has a chilling effect on human behavior. A study published in 2016 by Journalism and Mass Communication Quarterly revealed that in response to increased awareness of government surveillance, participants with opinions they believed to be in the minority decided to suppress their opinions and self-censor. Surveillance trains Americans to keep controversial opinions to themselves. Conservatives are creating a world in which people with unpopular opinions, such as critics of the government, are afraid to speak out. By sacrificing liberty for security, conservatives are creating a weak and docile American people, making them afraid to speak out if they have controversial opinions, and thus making them poor defenders of the American Republic. Conservatives are therefore sacrificing much for little gain. They have put their faith in the government and gotten little in return. If only they had applied as much scrutiny to government power here as they do in other areas. Thank you.
I think my libertarian friends want to make this an incredibly simple issue, but it's not that simple. It's not that we can just identify a terrorist and say, there's the terrorist, we're going to stop him just by eyeballing it. If anything, I think that could lead to mischaracterization of a lot of individuals and certain groups into society. The reason that we collect data the way that we do and the way that governments are able to look into this information ultimately is the same way that we've done warrants since the very beginning of American history. We're not going to go digging into your personal emails. I can't just pick one of you randomly, go ask the NSA, can you please just look into this information? That's not how it works. the court system still applies, albeit an internal court system, so as to keep that information private, so as to protect the privacy of individuals, not to harm it. However, that system is still in place, and so that system actually protects the information that we have. To this issue that this somehow makes the whole collection more complex or more difficult, I don't think it makes it more difficult. It makes it more complex because we have more options to look at so we can prevent these attacks in the future.
Well, with regard to the metadata issue, aside from the actual content of the conversations themselves, you can learn everything about a person from metadata. The NSA can learn where you go, what you do, who you speak to, and what you purchase. It can learn what your political affiliation is, your sexual orientation, and whether you own a gun, and this could in fact be disastrous. For example, in 2015, Senate Democrats attempted to unsuccessfully bar anyone on the US government's expansive terrorism watch list from buying guns. Do conservatives really believe that they wouldn't try it again? On top of that, in some aspects, the government can in fact look in on your calls. Under amendments to the FISA Act of 2008, when the government targets the communications of foreign entities, any calls of Americans that were incidentally collected are automatically included. These calls are accessed through a general warrant, so it's a blanket procedure rather than anything specific. And these general warrants were considered outrageous during the American Revolution. The British used these to enforce the Stamp Act. What is more, this process involves a court order that's basically a rubber stamp. 99.7% of warrant requests that have been approved in the 36 years since its inception. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. In the next section, we'll hear a little persuasion. Both sides will be tasked with the modest challenge of explaining why the other side, and indeed many of you in the audience, are wrong about everything you've ever believed, or your most deeply held opinions. So we'll start with the conservatives, who will explain why libertarians have got it all the wrong way up.
So I think that as I opened my remarks with, the point at which libertarians and conservatives agree is that we value individual liberty. I think conservatives also in particular value a politics of prudence, of making sure that we are making prudent decisions based on where we are in history, where we stand in relation to other entities, both internationally and domestically in our civil society. And I think that these are principles at which my libertarian friends grasp but misunderstand. Libertarian philosophy goes something like this. Individual liberty is supreme. Individual liberty is the ultimate good that we should aim at, as we've discussed extensively throughout this. And that's why we have things like the principle of non-aggression that my libertarian friends would hold to. The certain limits that they will hold to are for the purpose of ensuring that the individual still has his liberty. But I would venture to say that libertarian philosophy, when you think it through, actually leads ultimately to a tyrannical society. And I know you'll probably balk at me for saying that, but I mean it quite seriously. Because when we value individual liberty as the ultimate thing which we are going to hold up, inevitably our wills are going to have to conflict. The political theorist Thomas Dye once famously said that all political conflict can be attributed to either scarce resources or a difference in values. And that's absolutely true. I think that my libertarian friends understand that scarcity of resources. That's why a lot of times libertarians and conservatives can work together on economic issues, but sometimes they misunderstand the differing values as well. The fact that if I want to exert my will in a certain way, sometimes that's going to directly conflict with someone else exerting their will in a different way. So, for example, for an illegal immigrant who wants to cross over into America, he has made that choice with his individual will. Another individual may not want him here at all, and so at that point you have to have some kinds of limits, right? And so then eventually, that's a small scale issue though. Then eventually, if we continue to hold this up as the ultimate standard of all our laws, we get to a place where we have conflicting opinions, and we've devolved into, as much as my libertarian friends may not want to admit it, at least a quasi-anarchical state. I don't know that we would devolve into total anarchy, but we've seen how this has played out before in history. There are two good examples of this. First, the fall of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire became increasingly obsessed with individual liberty, with this idea that I can do whatever I want to do whenever I want to do it, just as long as I don't infringe on anybody else. Eventually, that led to the demise of Rome internally because of these kinds of conflicts. Among other factors, that led to the fall of the Roman Empire. What resulted was the feudal system, the ultimate tyrannical system, if you will. Another great example is in the French Revolution, where for very good reasons people were concerned about the government behavior. And I'm not advocating for the French government, of course, but rather a view that what these individuals ended up doing was holding individual liberty as the ultimate standard and arbiter of all truth. What happened? We ended up with Napoleon Bonaparte. That's what happens because you have such a disordered society that you must have someone to bring order back into it. So we believe that the conservative view takes these principles of liberty and of prudence and channels them as a means to living well as human beings. So we think we should have this individual liberty, but it should be aimed at being the best people that we can be, at having the options to make good choices, and not having options like destroying your life and the lives of others with drugs, and not having the option of having terrorists come in simply because you didn't want to be able to get a warrant to look at somebody's information. Things like that are why we believe that liberty should be channeled as a means to the end of human flourishing.
Thank you. And now the libertarians on why the conservatives are wrong.
In the United States of America, our founding fathers left us the truest bastion of classical liberalism that the world has ever known. Everyone in this room, whether they are a libertarian or a conservative, wishes to preserve this system of liberty. The difference is that, for libertarians, liberty is our core political value, whereas conservatives juggle a host of competing priorities, and often liberty loses. Liberty loses when the right of a business owner to hire people who happen to live on the other side of a national border is undermined by unsubstantiated fears of security or losing national identity. Liberty loses when narrow definitions of marriage prevail, ostensibly preserving the sanctity of marriage even as heterosexuals undermine it themselves. Liberty loses when the government dictates what people can put into their bodies and imprisons them for decades if they disobey. And liberty loses when taxpayers are compelled to annually contribute $600 billion to a wasteful and needlessly adventurous military. Now, this hypocrisy is not lost on conservatives. They would counter by saying that they are making compromises in some areas in order to overall preserve a society that is conducive to freedom. They say to libertarians that the U.S. is not currently a libertarian country and that pure libertarian policies cannot work in a non-libertarian environment. But there are two major problems with this defense. First, libertarians are also perfectly willing to compromise when necessary. We're just able to see these compromises for what they are, deviations from our principles rather than adjustments to them. In contrast, when conservatives compromise and undermine liberty in an attempt to strengthen it, they have no restraint mechanism. They have no line that they cannot cross in the name of pragmatism, or prudence, as you put it. That's why they can undermine federalism in the drug war and cannot name the constitutional power that they use to regulate immigration. And second, you simply cannot coerce your way to maintaining liberty. Conservatives correctly assert that liberty is fragile and is only sustainable in moral and community-oriented cultures. And libertarians agree. But libertarians recognize that you cannot dictate such virtuous cultures. Such cultures are products not of design from above, but rather of individuals choosing to come together in civil society and choosing to behave virtuously. Conservative attempts to promote such behavior through the state are ineffective. For example, all of the tax incentives in the world will not stop the decline in the institution of marriage, and neither will a ban on gay marriage. And conservative attempts to prohibit undesirable behavior are undermined by black markets, which often hurt communities more than help them. For example, the war on drugs has broken apart families and ruined communities, even though, tragically, saving these families and communities from narcotics was precisely what conservatives intended and intend. And perhaps most pertinently, when conservatives expand government to thwart change and then they lose power, their opponents will use this same government to accelerate change. Conversely, libertarians would seek to take these issues out of the political arena and rely on civil society. Thus, while conservative policies will fail to halt societal changes and empower those who would force them to accept these shifts, libertarians would instead allow these changes to occur at a natural pace and permit conservative dissenters their peace. And the irony is, of course, that conservatives are not entirely opposed to change. Somewhere between 40 and 60% of millennial Republicans now support gay marriage and marijuana legalization. So if these societal changes are going to transpire, let's have them take place in a society that allows for both experimentation and dissent, so that individuals can make up their own choices rather than having arbitrary outcomes imposed on them. I'll put it another way. Edmund Burke once said, "A state without the means of some change is without the means of its conservation." I therefore ask conservatives to let individuals having the liberty to make decisions for themselves be that means of change. And that is libertarianism. Thank you.
Came awfully close to some applause there. Well done for holding it back. Okay, now we have 20 minutes or so of questions. A few ground rules. If you could direct the questions to me, but make it clear which side you would prefer to answer, or possibly both. Long soliloquies that end with "don't you agree" are not questions. Also verboten are any references to lizard people, the jihadi takeovers of Oregon national parks, and anything Louise Mensch has ever said in her life. Other than that, please have at it.
My question, I would like to have the libertarians answer. Can you name a country or a civilization where libertarianism has been implemented and worked?
Certainly. Well, the fact of the matter is it has not been implemented at all. And the reason for that is that politicians enjoy money and power. Libertarianism is a philosophy about limiting government power. So politicians, of course, aren't going to tend to implement libertarian policies. Thank you.
On the gentleman in the vest.
Thank you. In this debate, I've heard a lot of specific policy discussion that's attributed to conservatism and then opposed from the realm of pure philosophy. I'm more interested in the specific question that was posed by the conservatives at the start of this debate. Where does freedom come to? And so my question for both sides is, what is the foundation of your idea of liberty? And if you don't have a specific basis from which you can defend that principle, how do you hope it to prevail in a pluralistic society?
Start with the conservatives.
We as conservatives, as I mentioned, believe that the individual is born with a certain inherent dignity. And we believe that that is the root of all of our rights. That combined for our human rights per se, and then our civil rights, we believe, come as a matter of practicality and a matter of prudence. So I think that there are two things here to discuss then. So for example, we believe in the right to life. Why? Because you cannot have any other right without the right to life. You have to live to be able to embrace those other rights. You are inherently, therefore, born with the right to life, and you have the liberty to enjoy that right. Then we look at something like civil rights. So for example, property rights. You simply need a place to live, and you need to be able to know that what is yours, that someone isn't going to just come and take it from you. And that's why we believe in civil rights. And I'm sure on at least some level you would agree with that as well. What we also believe, though, is that rights entail certain duties. So that means that because I have a right to life, that none of you can come and just kill me. You have the duty to not kill me. You have the duty to acknowledge my right to life. Similarly, you have the duty to not infringe on my civil rights. And then the government has the duty to ensure that those rights are protected and acknowledged. So what personal liberty looks like then in this context of rights and implied duties as a result is that civil liberty means I have the opportunity to embrace those rights that I have. That's why we have the Bill of Rights here in America, is I have the liberty to embrace those rights.
Okay, I'm going to throw this over to the libertarians so we don't run on.
Sure.
Hey, well, we're broadly and speaking in agreement with our conservative friends. We believe that liberty is not an end in itself, but a means by which humans can prosper through voluntary cooperation with consenting individuals. We value liberty for the ways in which it can protect us from the abuse of government. It can protect us from people like J. Edgar Hoover. And it can protect us from people who believe that they are wise and knowledgeable when in fact they are not. Thank you.
Okay. This gentleman here.
Yes, I'd like to initially direct this question to the libertarians. I understand that libertarians believe in both the right to travel and right to privacy, but I think in the case of travel to Cuba, there may be a conflict. One senator has said that all the hotels in Cuba are controlled by the Cuban military, and I understand from the past that Cuba has put Hollywood celebrities and Latin American authors under 24-hour surveillance, and that's a much bigger invasion of privacy than the NSA looking for your metadata. How would you reconcile privacy and the right to travel in Cuba?
Would you like to field it, or shall I?
Yeah, we don't think Cuba should be doing that, but we're not about to... We're not about to tell people that they can't go to Cuba because their rights might be infringed. It's their choice. Now, Cuba shouldn't be doing that, but the notion that we should be able to point to some country that doesn't have the same idea of rights as we do and say, well, there you can't go there, I don't see how that would be tenable.
The gentleman on the end.
Thoroughly enjoyed the debate thus far. I have a question for the conservative side. You mentioned that you thought terrorism was an existential threat, and that U.S. military dominance would be able to protect against an event such as North Korea launching a nuke that would travel 33 minutes to the United States. I would just have a question for how the United States military dominance would be able to protect either against terrorism as an existential threat or the North Korea ICBM. Thank you.
Well, a lot of the specifics we can leave to those who know a lot of our national secrets. There's a lot, quite frankly, that we don't know as private citizens. But we do know that these threats exist. We also know that there's been a great deal of U.S. military dominance and efforts that have made us safer, that have protected us from certain threats, that have protected us from attacks. The U.S. government has the capacity to block against North Korean aggression. The U.S. government has the capacity to go and wipe out the Islamic State and all of its terrorists. The problem is that a lot of times those aren't the decisions that our policymakers decide to go with. A lot of times we've had a soft foreign policy, especially as of recently, and even still under the new administration, where we don't use our capacities to their fullest extent. We do have programs encountering violent extremism that specifically seek to wipe out the terror threat. Those programs are flawed. They're a little bit untargeted, specifically to Islamic terrorism, which is the terrorism that is the largest threat we face. And so reforms to those programs, I think, would better insulate us against those threats.
The lady in the middle.
Hello. So I would like to direct my question toward the conservatives. You were discussing immigration, and you said that we have to do something about the illegal immigrants, correct? You say that illegal immigrants drain our economy, and then you go on to say that legal immigrants help our economy. So the only justification I really got from your statement was that our nation is our nation, and it's our government's job to protect us. But then not letting those illegal immigrants become legal, doesn't that do us a disservice to our economy?
Yes, I think this is maybe more nuanced than just making these blanket statements. So the reason that illegal immigrants don't contribute to our economy in the same way that a legal immigrant would is twofold. One, it is due somewhat to the welfare issue, but as my opponents rightly noted, that's not across the board the case. But the reality is only 11% of illegal immigrants actually contribute positively to the American economy. That means that 89% are not contributing positively to our economy. The reason for that being two things. First, that these individuals often are coming in low skilled, and so they're coming in not able to contribute the same amount to the economy that someone with a higher skill set would be able to. But secondly, if you had two individuals who had the same skill sets coming in, one legally and one illegally, the illegal immigrant is a lot less likely to pay taxes in the form of income taxes, in the form of property taxes. They're going to try to evade those taxes, and it makes sense because if you're here illegally, if you're violating the law every single day just by virtue of being here, you're not going to want to get caught. Taxes would be a very simple way to do that. That's just the fact that those individuals do not pay those taxes, and as a result, they do often end up being a net drain on the economy, depending on how you measure it.
Do we have another question for the Libertarians? This gentleman here with his right hand up. Yeah.
Thank you. My question for Libertarians is, so the political philosopher Robert Nisbet made an argument that the classical liberalism of the 18th and 19th centuries led directly to the cultural alienation in the 20th century. How do we keep libertarianism from devolving into libertinism, and how do we hedge against sort of the cultural degradation that happens when individuals only seek their own good and not the good of the communities that they're a part of?
Sure. Well, again, going back to the civil society question, we're not libertines, we're libertarians. We believe in individual liberty, and we believe that that's the best way to promote cooperation among consenting individuals. We support churches, families, communities, and clubs, and so on. Yeah, sure, please.
It's also worth noting that these institutions of civil society, they didn't come because a government created them. People came together of their own volition to form them. So the notion that if left to their own devices, people will just box themselves off and not interact with each other I don't see how the logic would flow from that.
Okay, I'd like a question which goes to both. Does anyone have one of those? Okay, the gentleman right at the back.
Good evening. This is more addressed to libertarians, but to both, really. I had to...
Well played, well played.
I had the opportunity last Friday night to spend the evening with a group called the Alexis Tocqueville Fellowship. They're a right-of-center think tank based in Paris. They're very small. They've only been around for about 15 or 20 years or so. But as you can imagine, they're very isolated there in Western Europe, particularly in Paris. Now, I had the opportunity to talk to many of the young people, kind of, the millennial generation, which makes up this think tank. And I asked them, what is it like over there? I mean, not just to compare and contrast between American and European politics, but we hear about the terror attacks, and we hear about, the EU, we hear about the European elections. So my question really to the libertarians is that they were telling us that these people, right, so they're just in shopping centers, they're walking around, and there are women, right, who are covered head to toe in full burqas, right? These are nice neighborhoods, affluent neighborhoods of Europe. And they explained to us that there's a reason that the far right, almost elements of pseudo-fascism, is on the rise in Europe. So my question to you is, how can you juxtapose, free markets and unfettered immigration and moving across borders? I mean, it seems to me that if you believe in that everyone can
Could we
be
stick to a
American,
question? We need to come to a
so
head.
do you all believe in citizenship? Because it seems to me that if everyone can be American, then no one can be.
There's an interesting point in the last sentence you gave. So and the whole question, but specifically, when you say that everybody can be American, that is true, and that's actually something that's very much unique to America. Because if you have somebody who is born in France and then moves to Germany, they can live their whole life in Germany and never become a German, right? And so you see a lot of these assimilation problems coming from that, coming from inevitable alienation from the fact that people cannot become part of these European cultures. In America, that's very different. we've always been way better at having people who come to our country assimilate, because we recognize that if you uphold and come to believe in American ideas, then you can indeed become an American. So it's for that reason that America is very much unique, and for that reason, we do not have the same assimilation issues that Europe has.
I'm not going to pretend that question was actually for you, so we'll take another one. Yeah, gentleman on the right.
So my question for both of you, as you have both sort of touched on the importance of the Founding Fathers and the Constitution and constitutional rights with liberty, is whether or not, from sort of your respective philosophical standpoints, you recognize a right to privacy built into the Constitution, and if you do, how that plays out with sort of the surveillance state and the Patriot Act. And I can kind of guess how the libertarians would go, but I'd love to hear the conservative standpoint especially.
Okay, conservatives first.
Well, as with most questions, I like to defer to Aristotle and go with the old golden mean. Yes, we do have to take privacy seriously, but it's a balancing act. It's not wholly about how can we respect our right to privacy. It's about how can we respect a right to privacy and the fact that we as individuals do have inherent rights to conscience that should not be infringed, with the idea that we live in community with one another, that our wills do conflict, that there have to be adjudications, and that decisions must be made that are not at all times going to just leave us to ourselves. See, if we were left to ourselves and our own devices, then for those of us in this room, likely nothing would happen. But for terrorists, for our enemies existing in the world, there are those who, if left to their own devices, would commit unspeakable acts of terror on mass levels and on individual levels as well. We have to take very seriously these threats. We have to contemplate how we're going to guard against them. And so when we look at like a right to privacy, that's not necessarily something that we find written into the Constitution. But it is still something that's part of the human makeup as part of our consciences.
And if I may chime in too, as a constitutional matter, the right to privacy was established in Griswold versus Connecticut. It was an issue about contraceptives. That's where it was found, kind of in the umbras and penumbras of the 14th Amendment. The right to privacy is, we can debate all day about whether or not that's a civil right. I'm willing to say, sure, it's a civil right. We don't want people just snooping in your stuff. It's also not an unlimited right. Like, that's why we have the ability of the government to obtain warrants to be able to get into your stuff if they need to. This is not something that the government can just go point blank getting into. So certainly we believe in that, but we believe that there are certain limitations to that.
Libertarians, is there a right to privacy in the Constitution? Or privacy, as you would all say it, I suppose.
Well, as a matter of fact, yes. Under the 9th Amendment to the Constitution, unenumerated rights are just as protected as enumerated rights. My conservative friends are wrong when they say that just because the right to privacy is not enumerated in the Constitution doesn't mean that it should be protected. Thank you.
A young lady in the third row.
Hello, I have a question for the libertarian side. So according to hhs.gov, in 2015, there were 33,000 deaths by opioid overdose, and the opioid crisis cost the United States $78.5 billion. We also know that drug addiction, and especially the opioid crisis, is destroying civil society because it's destroying individuals' ability to participate in work in other institutions locally and unable to care for their own families. How would libertarians who believe that civil society should address problems address a crisis which destroys civil society? And how does that relate to your view that these drugs should be legalized for recreational use?
I'm really glad you asked that question because I feel like I put my stance on addiction a tad too simplistically a little bit earlier. I want to flesh it out just a little bit, and it will come back to your point. So some of the major studies that sort of established our idea of addiction were sort of rats who were put in places where they had regular water and then they had drugged water. And they noticed that, the rats would just stick to the drugged water and they wouldn't go to the regular water until it killed themselves. But then people realized that when rats were stuck in these simulations with just water and drugged water, of course they were just going to go to the drugged water. So they made sort of a giant thing called Rat Park, where you had your drugged water and the regular water and food, but you also had toys, you had other rats to hang out with. Essentially, it was an actual society. Please stick with me. I have a point to make here. I swear. And
you have 1 minute and 30 seconds to get to this.
Wait, how long have I spent? Okay. So, because I do have a point. And in this, they noticed that the rats did not stick to the drugged water, all right? So in other words, addiction, as I said earlier, is much more a product of environment than it is about the drug itself. Now, how does that relate to your problem, or to your question? Well, it's not that civil society has failed to address drugs. It's that the decline in civil society that we've seen has led to these more barren environments. Charles Murray has written about this in Coming Apart. Thomas Putnam has talked about this with the decline of social capital. You see in these communities not drugs themselves causing communities to deteriorate, but you see a deterioration of these communities that cause people to turn to drugs. Did that answer your question? Hopefully. Well, close enough.
I don't think that addresses the issue once people are addicted to drugs, and I also don't believe that this is directly possible.
Okay. Well, if you want to argue that it goes, both drug addiction can come from people's environments and their situations, and also that once people are on drugs, they can make their lives worse, I'm perfectly willing to concede that. The point I'm trying to make is, if you're looking to stop the root cause, it's not looking at these drugs as addictive and therefore we must ban them, all right? Because that is not going to solve the problem. It's how can we strengthen civil society so that people will have environments in which they can flourish. Hopefully that answered your question.
And with that, I'm afraid we've run out of time for questions, and I'm going to move on to the conclusions. The first conclusion this evening will be delivered by the Libertarian side.
Tonight you have seen a great deal of certainty. Each side has been adamant that their political philosophy is correct. And no doubt such certainty can seem quite absurd when both sides reject it, because we can't both be completely correct. And tonight, this impression is profound because both sides consist of interns in their 20s debating ideas that have been discussed for centuries. I would like to ask the following, however. Which of the two philosophies before you do you think will remain certain about these issues 10 years from now? Will the 2027 conservative intern debaters still insist that marijuana or our current immigration poses a terrible threat to the safety of our society? Or will they have grown accustomed to it themselves and have therefore moved on to other issues? My point is that conservatism has and will continue to morph across time. It has, in the past, supported bans on interracial marriage, segregation, trade protectionism and isolationism, and even slavery. This is not because conservatives are bad people, but because, as Hayek has observed, the central impulse of conservatism is to resist change. It's to conserve, if you will. While admirable, having this at the core of your political philosophy is misguided, because it leads you to oppose with certainty the same policies which 50 years later you may defend. Meanwhile, as libertarians, our certainty does not apply to the past, nor do we put faith in those who heedlessly chase progress for its own sake as progressives do. We neither oppose nor push change, but rather allow change to happen naturally through liberty. But why is liberty the answer? Why is it supreme, as they put it? Well, it's because libertarians have the humility to recognize that no person can have all of the answers. Once again, Hayek discussed this point, observing that the knowledge of society is not comprehensive and shared by all. It's broken up, frequently conflicting, never completely collected, and dispersed among all individuals. How then can a leader have the information necessary to pick the outcomes that must be imposed? That is the central area where conservatives and libertarians diverge. Conservatives are willing to assume, through appeals to tradition, that they can determine what is best for society. For all of their aversion to the progressive planning of today, they are perfectly willing to adhere to the conservative plans of yesterday. Libertarianism instead rejects all cultural planning, or central planning, favoring the specific knowledge we all possess about our own circumstances over the limited, would-be comprehensive knowledge of those who find themselves in power. For this reason, While conservatism all too frequently bestows in a leader a confidence that he knows best, libertarianism instead instills a humility and the recognition that one does not know everything, and certainly not enough to justify coercing fellow citizens. And while conservatives and libertarians share the idea of mankind's imperfection, we handle this belief very differently. Conservatism views the masses with pessimism, agonizing over the mistakes they'll make without an imposed adherence to tradition. Libertarianism instead views the people not with optimism, but with the recognition that the judgments of individuals are collectively more innovative and wise than those who would seek to lead them. Moreover, we recognize that, since mankind is flawed, it's best not to confer too much power on any flawed, imperfect member. For if an individual makes a mistake, the fallout is minimal. But if a leader makes a mistake, the fallout is more widespread and often entrenched in what Milton Friedman referred to as the tyranny of the status quo. And so I submit to you that, in this search for the superior political philosophy, you should choose the philosophy that already recognizes, accepts, and even embraces the fact that one cannot have all of the answers, because there is no greater mechanism for dealing with the inevitable uncertainty to life than libertarianism's regard for the eternal principle of liberty. It's been a great debate. Thank you.
We're all here tonight because we cherish liberty. That's something to celebrate. I'd like to see the Center for American Progress and Brookings Institution get together and try to do the same. But even as we celebrate our shared love of liberty, we have to come back to our central question. For what is our liberty? Is there some end at which our freedom ought to be pointed? Conservatism says yes. Conservatism sees in liberty something precious that, if stewarded properly, can lead us to the kinds of lives we as human beings were meant to live. It's funny. Libertarianism criticizes conservatism for watering politics down into ever-changing principles. And yet libertarianism would make politics into a science, where all that matters is maximizing individual liberty. There's no taking into account of varying circumstances. Again, we're all different people born into different families and different societies. Churchill really eloquently discusses statesmanship. Statesmanship is not making the exact same decision. Statesmanship is knowing your principles and then using prudence to guide you to the best choices that will uphold those principles given your current circumstances. This is conservatism. There's a really beautiful line in the middle of Lincoln's Lyceum address given in 1838 before anyone really knew who he was, and he discusses the project of the founding. He says that the ambition of the founders staked to display before an admiring world the truth of a claim, then no more than a proposition, namely the capability of a free people to govern themselves. There's a little bit of a misunderstanding about what it means to govern the self. See, self-governance is at its core and at its point of departure an internal process. It's about ordering the passions rightly. It's about being guided by reason, about learning to be charitable, to be magnanimous, to be honorable, and that's even before political life has entered the picture. But how is it that we learn to do those things? How is it that we become fully human? This is the practice of politics. Because we become fully human in the context of others. It's through the associations that surround us. Now, our libertarian friends have been making a flawed assumption throughout this debate. They assume that to know the good is to do the good. And as much as I agree with Aristotle on everything, I disagree with him on this one thing. It's the only time you'll ever hear me say this. We know what is right, and yet often we fail to do so. We oftentimes need forces to habituate us towards certain moral norms. Now, libertarianism creates a false dichotomy. They assume that we either must have the individual making their own choices in all times and places, or the government must decide for us. But this is simply false. We're born into families. Many of us go to churches. We intern at great places like Cato and Heritage. We're going to go enjoy libations together after this. Sorry, Mom, that I just talked about alcohol in front of you. I know you're watching on the live stream. But we find ourselves in institutions, and these institutions shape our behavior in certain ways. See, we are what we eat. Our liturgies shape us in certain ways. We oftentimes need those around us to habituate our behavior towards the good. When we talk about the good, we talk about living together well. We talk about ordering ourselves. We talk about being charitable, magnanimous, and the rest of it. And the associations around us are making certain claims on how we ought to live. We owe it to these voices to listen to what they're saying, because we just might discover what it means to be human in the process. See, our institutions are free. Men are not angels, but there are better angels within our nature. Free institutions that make certain claims on us, law being one of those institutions, allow us to call forth the better angels within our nature. And if we all leave here tonight knowing one thing, I hope it's not just policy. I hope we leave here tonight with the knowledge that we have the ability and the opportunity to call forth what is best in one another. And I think that if we do that, then we'll really be honoring the enterprise of the founding. Then I think we'll really be showing that free people actually can govern themselves. Thanks.
Well, that concludes this evening. So like the good conservatarian fence straddler that I am, having told you not to do something, I'm now going to give you carte blanche to do it. If we could have a round of applause for John Conakey, Jack Brown, Meridian Poulton, and Elle Rogers.